I'm Alex Zettl. I'm a professor of physics emeritus at the University of California at Berkeley, and it takes me great pleasure in participating in this legacy project interview of Professor Marvin Cohen. Marvin and I have known each other for many decades, almost 40 years. We've worked closely together, and Marvin is a theorist, a condensed matter theorist. I'm an experimentalist. So I do experiments and Marvin does theory, and we've worked closely together for those times. Marvin?
Hi. Well, I'm Marvin Cohen, University Professor of Physics and Professor of the Graduate School in the department here at Berkeley. And as Alex mentioned, I'm a theoretical condensed matter physics. That means I work on materials, but I don't go in the lab. All the good stuff is done by Alex, and I try to explain his results or predict new results. And as he said, we worked very effectively together over the years. And I appreciate him interviewing me today, and I appreciate all the people who are participating in this project.
The first time I met Marvin, I'd known about Marvin because I was an undergraduate at Berkeley while he was a faculty member, but I actually didn't take any courses from Marvin. The first time we formally met, I was interviewing for a job at Berkeley, a faculty position, and Marvin was on my committee, the interview committee. And the professors I had met earlier in the day, they asked me really hard physics questions, and to see if I really knew my stuff. And I got to your office, Marvin, and you didn't ask me any hard questions. Instead, you showed me what you were doing. And it was wonderful. It was a breath of fresh air. I was really impressed with what you were doing. And I thought, this is the kind of place I want to be as a faculty member. And so that was sort of the beginning of our relationship. Got off on a very good start.
By the time you got to my office, I was convinced that we had to do everything we could possibly do to bring you into our department. So if I remember right, I started telling you about the problems on campus, and they were parking problems. I said, outside of that, everything's fantastic, and you really have to come. And you did.
Right. You were very effective.
And it worked well.
Marvin, when you introduced yourself, you said you were a university professor. What is that?
A university professor is supposedly a member of all of the campuses of the university. And at the beginning, one of my duties was to go around to all the other campuses and look at what's going on. And I presumably had the opportunity to stay at each of the campuses or even teach there, but I chose to be at Berkeley. The other thing is that university professor, and I'm still considered university professor even after retiring from teaching. It's a title I can retain for life, which is very nice. On the other hand, you report to the president of the university, not to an individual chancellor. And the president always has a committee that the president wants to put you on. So at the beginning, I was very conscientious and talked to the various presidents. And I ended up on a lot of committees. So I sort of stopped talking to presidents after a while and focused more on local things, because the kinds of things that the university as a whole is interested in is 50-year plans. And those are very difficult and take a lot of time, and they're not always that effective. So I felt sticking to the campus and the business of the campus would be a better role for me.
Well, it's quite an honor, and I know there are very few university professors in the entire University of California system, so it's wonderful that you have that title. I also know you have your own parking space, and you mentioned parking was a problem many years ago, and it continues to be a parking, so that shows your stature. Tell me about your childhood. I know you grew up in San Francisco, California, just across the bay from Berkeley, but I understand you were born and as a young child lived in Canada. So you're a Canadian by birth. Tell us about your childhood in Canada and then moving to the United States.
Well, I was born in Montreal, and part of my family, my uncles and the rest, had moved to San Francisco. My parents decided to move to San Francisco, and I did when I was 12. And I was really looking forward to it. I had built a Golden Gate Bridge out of toothpicks, and I expected beaches and all those things that were the California image. So I came out at age 12, and in San Francisco enrolled in school. And the teachers there, and particularly the counselor, felt that since I was an immigrant, I was sort of behind in social things. They told me my skills as far as a student in classwork was very good, but I should try very hard to catch up socially. Now, if you tell a 12, 13-year-old that, they really don't know what to do. So I went around smiling at people, and I didn't quite know what to do, but I did continue in that mode for the next 10 years, and was an undergraduate at Berkeley in a fraternity, and tried to catch up socially. It was not the best for my academic career, and I didn't really work hard until I got to graduate school at the University of Chicago.
But was there a big cultural difference between Canada and the United States, Montreal and San Francisco? I guess Montreal is very international as well, and primarily English speaking, so you didn't have a language barrier, knowing only French or so on. But what impressed you the most when you came to California?
Actually, I was surprised when they were treating me like someone who came from a backward place, because Montreal was much more cosmopolitan than San Francisco. It was larger, it was more activity, although I really loved San Francisco. But it was a surprising welcoming in the sense that they had no feeling for the fact that I came from a large city. But I loved San Francisco, and I loved being here, and I always have.
So you mentioned building a model of the Golden Gate Bridge out of toothpicks. That sounds like the realm of an experimentalist more than a theorist. So were you interested in science and mathematics at a very early age, and you were tinkering around, or when did that develop for you, that interest in physics or science in general and mathematics?
Yeah, I tinkered from a very young age. I built all kinds of things, and there were things that you would associate with someone who was going into a career of experiment. I liked science, and I was so blessed by the fact that from a very young age, I always knew what I wanted to do. As soon as I figured out what physics was, that's what I wanted. Now, I switched from your area of experimental physics to theoretical physics when I was around 7 or 8 years old. My grandfather had a farm outside of Montreal, and we were playing catch. Another child and I, and a high school student came over, and he said, "When you throw the ball in the air, I just learned in school that I can calculate exactly where that ball is without measuring anything." And I couldn't believe it. And that concept that you could explain things that happen in nature with just mathematics or physical feeling, that was it. That was my idea for life. And I still am amazed that people can tell exactly where the ball is, exactly when we have an eclipse, exactly where those rockets go. And so my fascination began then. So I always knew I wanted to be a physicist.
So aside from quantum mechanics, I guess you were learning about classical physics, because you're an expert in quantum mechanics now, and you really can't tell where the ball is exactly at a certain time.
That's right.
But that came later.
That came
so
later.
were you able in junior high school and high school in San Francisco to pursue science sort of seriously, or were the classes invigorating, instructive, or were you sort of way ahead of everyone and it was boring? Or what was it like to be in pre-college school here in California?
Well, it was enjoyable, but the physics class, basically, we just made a chart of the weather every day. So if students are going to take physics classes of that kind, I think they'll be turned off from physics. I think it was not very inspiring. Math courses were pretty good, and they were taught by the coaches mostly. Basically, it was rigorous, and the math was good, and the classes were good. I went to George Washington High School in San Francisco. It was a very good high school. But my focus became music, and I spent most of my efforts in the area of music. This was part of my socially catching up.
And so what instruments did you learn to play?
I started on the clarinet and then played the saxophone. So at that point, I played the saxophone a lot because I got into jazz bands. And as a teenager, I was playing all around the Bay Area. And at one point, Johnny Mathis was actually in my band, so he was pretty active. Nowadays, I play the clarinet exclusively, and I play every day, but I play classical music, and my teacher plays for the San Francisco Symphony. And during this period, we're doing it on Zoom, so when my tone isn't that good, I blame it on my laptop.
So music is, very artistic and so on, and some might say it's very different from physics. There's sort of an aesthetic quality to it, and physics, in a sense, as you said, very precise, predicting things. Is there any disconnect between music and physics, or you think they go hand in hand? Does physics enhance your playing, or your playing enhance your ability to be a good theoretical physicist?
I sort of keep them separate, although people claim that that individuals with skills in mathematics and also physicists tend to like music and to play musical instruments. The peculiar thing is sometimes I can play a piece that I really worked on, and I go into some automatic mode, and I could be going along extremely quickly on the clarinet, and at the same time I can do a calculation. It seems to be disjoint, the fact that once you get things into muscle memory, you can still think about other things. Now, I know there are a lot of people who can think of more than one thing at a time. My wife is one of those. I can only really do one thing at a time. I do things serially, and I just do one thing at a time. I don't bundle, I don't push things together. But I can play music and think about other things. So I'm not sure how the brain is constructed with respect to these things, but, and I don't know if there's a connection, except that in music, you really have to count. It's very important. And one of my teachers along the way was saying that when I was having difficulty with a piece, she would say, here I am teaching a theoretical physicist how to count. And it's just the way it is. It's not so easy to do when you're playing an instrument.
So you mentioned playing around the Bay Area with, at different clubs and so on. That sounds interesting. Was that also in college? I mean, tell me about your Berkeley undergraduate experience. You were at Berkeley as an undergraduate as well, a physics major, and did you continue playing, the saxophone during that time, or just were you taking mostly physics courses or music courses, or what was that like?
I didn't take any music courses. I took physics courses, and the physics requirements were very easy. So you could take psychology and philosophy. So I took all kinds of things, but I didn't really work that hard. This was in the 1950s, It was very different, a very different time. The main thing was getting the decorations up for the dance on Saturday night. I was in a fraternity. I ended up being president of the fraternity. And it was just not an atmosphere of tense competition the way it is now. And I had enough time to do all these other outside things. My physics courses were good, but just in general, I didn't have to work that hard.
Well, it sounds like you had a good time.
I had a good time.
Were there any people, mentors or faculty members while you were an undergraduate that had a particularly strong influence on you, that took you under their wing or tutored you or that you looked up to that helped in your development as a physicist?
I didn't really seek mentorship. And so we were required to go to our advisors. And advisors, some of them were very kind and would get you out of a class if you didn't like the class or whatever. And one of those was Art Kipp in our department. He passed away years ago. But I didn't really have a good understanding of the various areas of physics, what area I was going to go into. I thought I would just go along and find out what's happening. And so I didn't seek mentorship. That's a lot better now. We really do pay much more attention to our undergraduates and try to give them a good idea of what the future is for them and what the various fields are.
I see. Well, it's interesting that you mentioned Art Kipp. My parents were babysitters for Art and Joan Kipp while they were graduate students at Berkeley. So they've known Art for many, many years. Does it seem odd to be in a fraternity? You said you're president of the fraternity and so on, and that's, when I was an undergraduate, the frat boys, they were just partying all the time. They couldn't possibly be physics majors at the same time. So was that unique for you or just a different time?
No, I think it's a different time. The fraternity had very high grade average in general. There were a lot of pre-meds, that's why. And several of my fraternity brothers went into law. One friend who was in physics won the Nobel Prize a couple of years ago for the discovery of gravitational waves. This is Barry Barish. He and two other people received the Nobel Prize. And it was not just play all the time. And people did really pay attention to the university. So it was a good balance.
And you went to Chicago as a graduate student. That's where you got your PhD. What was Chicago like? Was it different from Berkeley? How do you contrast it, and how did that influence your life going to Chicago?
Well, it was radically different. First of all, in Berkeley during the 50s, you could leave your door open. It was just, as far as I knew, no crime. It was very casual. It was certainly nothing like it was in the 60s. Chicago, students were getting accosted. They were being murdered. It was a terrible neighborhood. But the university is a fine university. It has great traditions. And for graduate study there, it was great for training someone like me, because here as I said, I had been fairly loose, fraternity, playing in bands. I did do some playing when I was an undergraduate at Berkeley. And so I really focused on physics, and I liked it, but it was very, very different.
And could you tell us, sort of in layman's terms, what you did as a PhD thesis project? What was your specialty? What problems did you solve as a graduate student?
Well, it was curious because I started work with, I was thinking of going into a field called particle physics, where you look at the very elementary particles. And one of the professors there told me that there was a new professor that came in and he's in condensed matter physics, which is the physics of materials, and I should just go talk to him. When I went to talk to him, he thought I was coming to do work under him, and it was a question of whether he was going to be my supervisor. It was not my intention, but that was the understanding. So before he gave me a chance to talk, he just gave me assignments, books to read. And I went off, and after a couple of weeks, I realized he was running my life much better than I was. And his name is Jim Phillips. So I decided that I would go into that field. It was very interesting. And there was another person there, no relation, Marvin Cohen. And they were very inspiring. And then Jim Phillips gave me a problem, and I worked on it. And then he gave me another problem, and he went off to Cambridge on sabbatical. The problem he gave me was to look at how electrons move in semiconductors. But while he was gone, I got interested in the field of superconductivity. Superconductivity is fascinating because if you have a superconductor and you make a ring of it, if you allow electrons, put electrons in to go around in a circle, they will essentially go around forever, no resistance. And I came up with the idea that even though previous to that time, only metals could do that because metals are very conducting, my theory said that you could have a semiconductor be a superconductor. So I went off and calculated all this, and then the day appeared when he was coming back from Cambridge and I hadn't done his other problem. And so the faculty, Marvin Cohen and other faculty members, thought that the thing I had done on my own was good enough for a thesis, and they said, stay home for 3 days and we'll talk to him.
And in fact, that's one of the things you're very famous for, is solving that problem and making those theoretical predictions. I remember a number of years ago, and you've maintained an interest in that field, superconductivity, throughout your career, and you were helping make a film or video of superconductivity, and you were trying to do it with modern dancers. And I recall, in one of the theories of superconductivity, these electrons, they pair. And so you were pairing dancers, modern dancers with each other, and they were dancing around the floor and then pairing up. Was that sort of your idea to put that into the film?
Yes, it was done on campus. And it was done with people from dramatic arts. And it was filmed by Nova, and it was wonderful because, as you say, the reason that superconductors superconduct is that electrons that normally repel each other in a superconductor, they attract each other. And this dance that I choreographed, they had students here, dance students. And the peculiar thing about it is your dancing partner is about 10 feet away from you. So it's not like the usual close dancing. So the couples mix with each other. And I sat on a stool and watched it, and they said, okay, we're lowering the temperature, go superconducting. And I watched the students move into this phase, and it was really great.
It's a very visual way of presenting that. And Marvin, you mentioned at Chicago, high energy physics was sort of a big deal. It was at Berkeley too, with Lawrence making discoveries with the cyclotron and the Lawrence Radiation Laboratory being established and so on. And how was condensed matter or materials physics viewed at that time? Was it sort of at the level of high energy physics in terms of stature?
I think not. I think what happened was physics went through a period where people felt that there was a hierarchy. And this more you got down to fundamentals, the more important it was. And fundamentals got confused with getting down to smaller and smaller numbers of particles. Like we're made out of atoms. The atoms are made out of other things. And so if you kept going, you'd get down to particles. And the idea that the collective motion of particles and atoms was just as important didn't really come out until years later. So when I got to Berkeley, there was sort of a hierarchy, but it changed. In fact, now condensed matter physics is the largest branch of physics. And the nice thing about it, it's right in a Goldilocks spot for sizes of things that it deals with. So it does deal with some very small things and very large things, not as large as astronomers do. But you can use the theory for applications. And the theory also has a big influence on fundamentals of physics in all branches.
Right.
So it's a very nice field.
And so after you received your PhD from Chicago under Jim Phillips, you went to Bell Laboratories. And Bell Laboratories in Murray Hill, New Jersey, at the time was sort of the preeminent scientific laboratory in the world. And not just for doing telephone research, but fundamental physics research. So tell me about going to Bell Laboratories and what that was like.
Bell may have been the best, that particular laboratory may have been the best physical laboratory of all time. The number of experimentalists doing different things and inventing things. They invented the transistor, the solar battery, and then later on computer languages. And I was in the theory group. I was a postdoctoral in the theory group. And I remember showing up the first day and they said, "This is your office." And they told me that was the only instruction I was going to get, except we don't usually come in when it's really snowy. And we like to play chess before lunch and play Go after lunch. And the only thing you want to be sure of is to show up at tea. Because in those days, we didn't have the internet. So people who traveled would come to tea and they would tell us what's going on in the whole world. And I just had a wonderful time. I wandered around the halls, I did physics, talking to people, working with absolutely extraordinary people, and I was able to get experiments done. But then I was asked by Berkeley, Stanford, and UC San Diego to come give a talk. And I went out to give talks in these three places, and I came back to Bell. And when I got to Berkeley, I didn't realize these were recruiting talks. And when I got back, I said, "Berkeley has made me an offer." And Bell Labs postdocs were supposed to stay 2 years, and I'd only been there a year. And I said, "I'm going because I want to go back to Berkeley. My family's in San Francisco. I'm an undergraduate with Berkeley, and I'm Berkeley. I have to be in Berkeley."
But Bell Labs also had staff scientists who were there their entire career.
Yes.
And that must have been a huge draw for you, too. So was it a difficult decision to leave Bell Laboratories, or were you, just dying to come back to academia or going to academia and come back to Berkeley?
Well, from the professional point of view, I realized that staying on at Bell, I was really productive there and things were going great, would have been a great thing. And they talked to me for hours. And at the end of those sessions, I would say, "Everything you're saying makes sense, but my decision is an emotional one. I want to be at Berkeley, and sort of logic's sort of my religion, but then I put logic aside, and that's what I wanted to do, and it was a very good choice."
How did that work to give you an offer? Were you recruited by someone or a committee, or they just said, you should apply and you came? Or how did it really work?
I just came in and they sent me to see Charlie Cattell. Charles Cattell was a preeminent condensed matter theorist. He developed a group at Berkeley. Some of them ended up getting Nobel Prizes, and he's the one who elevated condensed matter physics at Berkeley to a level of particle theory. And Charlie said, "You're giving a department colloquium, make sure it's a good one." But be careful, because at the end, Steven Weinberg is going to ask you a really hard question, and it's very important that you do well. I had no idea what was going on.
Did Steven Weinberg ask you a hard question?
Weinberg asked me a hard question, which turned out to be easy, but I made it sound hard. So,
how did it feel to return to Berkeley, your undergraduate institution, as a faculty member? Did you party as much as you did as an undergrad, or had you matured and were a bona fide faculty member, or how did you feel coming back?
I matured, but Berkeley went the other way. This was 1964. So when I arrived, Mario Savio was on the police car. But when I was in the department, it took me a while to adjust, because Emilio Segre was a very formidable person, and he had worked with Enrico Fermi, who was my real hero. And it was so hard for me to call Emilio. I'd go, And I had been in one of his classes. I think I dropped it, actually. And then he asked me if I would work on a problem that Fermi and Teller had worked on for him, but they had worked on it and it didn't seem to work very well. And he asked me if I would work on it. Turned out that I wasn't that interested in the problem, but I worked on it and I solved it. But my goal was to be near Emilio and find out all these stories about Fermi, and hear all the stories about that period in Rome when Emilio was working on just great physics. Now on the campus, everything was going crazy. I mean, the difference between Berkeley in 1964 than in the late 50s when I was an undergraduate was really dramatic.
So you mentioned Mario Savio, on the steps of Sproul Hall and Sproul Plaza, packed with students. Were you there on the steps with him, grabbing the microphone, or where were you?
I was in the audience. I was in the audience and I was watching him, and I was just amazed. The curious thing is to give you insight into the mind of a physicist, is that they had an anniversary, I think 40th anniversary or whatever, of the event. And so I went down to see that, and all the students around, I realized, weren't born at the time when the real event happened. But I saw the enactment of the Mario Savio thing. And then I really felt good about myself, because I realized that I was standing there watching the scene, and I was thinking about the same thing I had thought about 40 years earlier, that I really have a lot of work to do. I had to get back to my office as soon as I can.
And Mario Savio became a physics professor later in life as well, so yeah. It's kind of interesting. In your own research, as a theorist, you need money to support postdocs and graduate students, and how did that work early on in your career? What organizations funded your research, and how has that continued to today? How has the funding worked?
Well, that's worked out very well for me. Cattell put me on his National Science Foundation grant, and I still have that grant. And it turns out it's the oldest National Science Foundation grant in the country, from what I can tell, and I talked to heads of the NSF, and they say that's true. And then after about a year, I got involved with people at the Lawrence Berkeley Laboratory, which is financed by the Department of Energy, and created a connection and got other people in condensed matter involved with the Lawrence Berkeley Laboratory. So over the years, I've been financed by the National Science Foundation and Department of Energy.
And interestingly enough, the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory started off as a high-energy physics lab, but now it does a lot of work in condensed matter biological sciences, climate change science, and so on. It's really quite diversified and different from the way it was in its Lawrence Radiation Laboratory days when Ernest Lawrence founded it. So it's really branched out.
Yes, I think we made a big difference in spreading out the interests of people up there. And I remember Louis Alvarez, when I first came here, asked me to give a lecture at his house because he had a special seminar. And I talked about work in high temperature superconductivity, where you've made great contributions. I was probably showing your data. And afterward you said, you know, I really have to pass the torch to you guys. And so the idea of the Lawrence Berkeley Laboratory being a center for particle physics was changing. And that probably came or began around the time that I arrived.
So today, Bell Laboratories really doesn't exist anymore as it did when you were there. And preeminent research labs like at IBM or Exxon or Xerox Palo Alto Research Center, they've all gone away. In a way, I guess the national laboratories and universities are taking their place. Do you think they're a good substitute, or is it sad to have those research institutions gone from the United States?
I think it's very sad. I think Bell Labs was a national treasure. It was run by a monopoly, AT&T, and when they broke it up and they said it would still do as well, they were wrong. IBM gave up a lot of its fundamental research and moved into software, and although they still do some good research, Xerox down in Palo Alto started off doing wonderful research, and Steve Jobs came by and saw all those wonderful things they had developed in the computer area, and that was essential for the creation of Apple. So nowadays, the old labs like Westinghouse, RCA, General Electric, Bell Labs, IBM, and so forth and so on, and they're just not doing fundamental research. And things have changed. So the question is, where do our best graduate students go? Well, always they went to universities, and the Berkeley graduates are populating the best universities in the world. And they're tending now to also go to places like Google and Facebook and companies that want them, because in physics we're taught how to solve problems. So they want problem solvers, and they're usually very good with computers. So in addition to being able to handle big data, things of this kind, they are very useful for some of these other companies.
So I've seen a list of your graduate students, the students who've gotten PhDs under your supervision, and postdoctoral students who were trained in your laboratory, your theoretical laboratory. It's really an impressive list, and you must take great pride in having these people be, they really have stellar positions throughout the world. They're leaders in theoretical physics. Do you still stay in touch with them, or what's your relationship with your former students and postdocs?
Very strong relationship. And first of all, I have the greatest appreciation of the fact that I had access to these brilliant people. The students have been wonderful. I've had just incredible students who make me look good. And they have gone on to careers that are very impressive, and their students are excellent. One of them got a Nobel Prize. And they come from around the world. For example, I have several students from Korea that have started off wonderful groups. And I remember visiting one of my students in Korea, and he said, "Come here, I want to show you your grandchildren." And there was a lineup of Korean students who were the students of my student.
So some people say, well, we're training these foreign students, and then they go and they become our competitors in the foreign countries. Do you see that as an issue, or what are the advantages for us to be training these brilliant people?
Well, I can tell you a story. When I was president of the American Physical Society and talking to people in Congress and President Bush at the time, there was a feeling that we ought to be very careful about visas and these foreign students. And one of these people from Congress said what you said. Here, you're developing these foreign students, they're going back, they're competing with you, and you're asking us for money to compete with the people that you created. And said, what have you got to say about that? I said, you're right, but I knew that logic would not work with them, so I just used the following. I said, when we have good foreign students, many of them stay here and they do incredible things. And when they go back to their home countries, we usually have a friend for life. However, if you want to change the way we do things, I want to tell you that right now the international language of physics is broken English, and it will change to broken Mandarin if we don't pay attention. That worked.
You mentioned your stint as president of the American Physical Society, and that's an important position. What challenges and opportunities did you encounter as president of that organization?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, I've served my time on committees. I've been a good, responsible faculty member, but I didn't seek committees or a lot of administration. So I was pulled into this kicking and screaming, but I learned a great deal. And it was really a good experience. You start off, you go through 4 years basically. In the third year, you're president. The fourth year, you're past president. And you get to do a lot in the way of telling the world about physics and also in administrating things. And it just so happens that when I was president of the American Physical Society, it was the World Year of Physics. So I traveled all around the world and talked about Einstein, because the World Year of Physics was 2005, and Einstein in 1905 did incredible things in the little patent office all by himself. And so I was able to tell the world about Einstein and to discuss many of his achievements, and it from China to Africa. It was really an incredible opportunity for me to speak about physics and how much I love physics. At the same time, I was telling everybody about Berkeley. And so it was a good experience. The other thing is, like some institutions, like here, like the group taking care of this, we had very good support people. And so I didn't have a lot of homework, and I could really make decisions. And I didn't have to answer it. Once I got to the third level in the series of positions and was president, I could make decisions.
So one thing the American Physical Society is focused on right now is increasing diversity in physics. There are very few women, for example, in physics, and they're trying to change that. Your own group, from my experience, has been very diverse. I mean, sort of a model of what physics groups could be. Was that a challenge already when you were president of the American Physical Society? Was that already being discussed then, or is that more recent?
Yes, I served on many committees about women in physics. And it turns out, because I do theoretical physics, and this is a field where women can work in and also during childbearing years continue to work in without having a lab to watch. I don't know about now, but when I was active with graduate students, I had the largest group of women students in the department. And over the years, I had also a large group of foreign students. So the point was, once we got into the room and went to the blackboard, it was mathematics, and the cultural differences and the gender differences and the rest were not major. The only difference I found between my male students and my female students were that the male students always had a higher opinion of themselves than perhaps was warranted, and the female students perhaps always had a lower opinion. And so it was part of my job, I felt, to really tell these young women how good they were. And they've done very, very well.
The awards you have won are many. I've seen your CV. It's just pages long of the awards you've won over the years. And there's one I'd like you to tell us a little bit about, and that's the National Medal of Science. Can you tell us what that award was about and how it was awarded to you?
Yes, that was a wonderful experience. It's awarded by the President of the United States. And you go to the White House, and they have a lot of good food. And my wife is in the art world, and so she was going around telling me how much each of those paintings cost. And so that was a good experience. And then President Bush put the medal around my neck. And then he sat and talked to me for a while. And we had a very interesting exchange. He was talking about his family, wanted to know about my family, and my wife was not a fan of his, and I had mixed feelings, but he was very congenial and seemed to know about what I had done, and so it was a great experience.
Well, I think he valued, good science and the people who are driving it. And so recognizing people like you was a good thing. So we've talked about your research a bit here, but not so much your teaching. So you were an active professor, teacher, teaching physics courses for over 40 years. And how was that like? What were the challenges and rewards for being a teacher? I understand you were teaching mostly graduate solid-state physics courses, but how was that?
Well, I enjoyed teaching a lot, and it was not a big effort for me. I know I have colleagues who are really good teachers, put in a lot of time, and they find it difficult. There's the old joke, if you walk into an undergraduate class and you say good morning, they say good morning, and if you walk into a graduate class and you say good morning, they write it down. So the difference between undergraduate and graduate was quite different. So the undergraduates asked questions. They didn't believe the special theory of relativity. I remember some guy saying Einstein was working with trains, but we should work with airplanes, and all kinds of things of that kind. So I preferred graduate teaching because these were, in many cases, these were people who were going to do research. And so I taught graduate research. In particular, one course I sort of instituted here, and it went on and still going on. And it was a graduate course in my field, condensed matter physics. And after many years, I co-authored a book based on that course. And I saw just fantastic students. But you couldn't tell in the class who was nodding and saying yes, and somebody at the back of the room reading the Daily Cal who really got it. But you could tell when they wrote their research papers and when they wrote their exams. So it's very different in graduate classes.
Did your teaching style change over the years, or were you always sort of a blackboard person, or did you end up using PowerPoint the last few years, or how did your method of teaching change?
All chalk and blackboard.
And that's equally effective today as it was in the 1950s, I guess, or before that. Marvin, there's a beautiful new modern interaction center in the physics department at Berkeley called the Marvin Cohen Condensed Matter Physics Interaction Center. Tell me how that came about.
Well, it came about through generous contributors who wanted to honor me, and I greatly appreciate it. And it's a place where we can sit and talk, and also, thanks to you, have a plasma screen so we can plug our laptops in, and it's always active. There are always people in there, and they're talking physics, and I hope it'll be a place where great discoveries are made.
Yeah, it's very popular with students, faculty, and postdocs alike. So congratulations on putting that together. You mentioned some of your research, but I know in the 1960s you were working on semiconductors, which are central to the electronics industry. And you worked on silicon, making predictions of what the electronic properties of silicon were like. And I think it's fair to say that without your work, Silicon Valley would not exist as a technology hub. And so I imagine you must be very wealthy personally, having patented all those computer programs and approaches that you developed in the 1960s.
Well, thank you. You're being really generous, but I should tell you that Charlie Cattell would corner me and say, patent, patent, patent. And for me, patent was not, it wasn't a dirty word, but it wasn't the way to go. And so I never patented anything. And so I'm afraid it's just my university salary allows me to live the lifestyle that I'm living.
Truly dedicated to science. So in your research and in condensed matter physics research in general, supercomputers are absolutely essential. So, tell me the role they play today. Are they as important as I've said, or just sort of a useful tool and you don't really need them? Or how important are really powerful computers today in research?
Well, they're very important. And just to give you a quick idea of how things changed, when I wrote these first programs to compute electronic structures, semiconductors, people really thought that this was not the way to go. And I remember that at a conference, someone said, that's just mindless research. And I said, I could do mindless research without a computer. And that was the beginning of just talking back to the skeptics. The Russians were particularly against using computers. Nowadays, the computer programs are so much more sophisticated than the things that I developed. In fact, I was at a meeting in Paris and somebody was selling computer programs. Somebody wanted to sell me my old computer program for $300. And I complained. I said, only $300? You know how much work I put into that? Anyway, nowadays, computers are very important, but you have to be careful because there are computer programs that are sort of canned programs that you buy and you put in numbers and then you accept what comes out. If you don't understand what's going on, you can make some big mistakes. So there are people who are doing wonderful things with supercomputers and some people who do not really have a deep understanding of what calculations mean.
Right, it's not just a computer, but you have to have the formalism that you've developed that goes with it, and the computer becomes a tool for doing large calculations very quickly.
Right.
I have a last question for you. Tell me about Popoki. Who is Popoki?
I had a cat named Popoki, and I got a license plate with Popoki's name on it, and it was on my little VW Bug, and I would drive it to campus, and people would ask me about Popoki. Popoki was born in Hawaii when I was on sabbatical in Hawaii. Theoretical physicists can take sabbaticals in Hawaii and work on the beach. And so I brought Popoki back from Hawaii, and Popoki means cat in Hawaiian. And when we moved, when we visited Hawaii years later, I actually met the governor, and I said, I have someone who's born in Hawaii. I'd like to bring them back for a while because we were going to take this sabbatical or whatever. And the governor said, of course. And then when I said he was a cat, they said, no way. They have these strict laws there. So anyway, Popoki was a great cat.
I understand Popoki had a bar mitzvah as well, right?
Yes. He had a bar mitzvah. Every summer, all the visitors that we had in the physics department would come to Popoki's birthday party. And it would be a great event.
So you're sort of a cat person.
I'm a cat.
I've never known you to have a dog. Is that somehow connected to your personality. You can't really train cats or herd them. They're on their own, and they're probably deep thinkers.
Yeah.
Does that match your personality more, or why are you a cat person?
I think they're philosophers. I think I now have a cat called Fawcett, and he is gray, looks just like Popoki, and both my wife and I are cat people, and a lot of our life is focused on Fawcett.
Great. And if you had to be an undergraduate today, starting at Berkeley today, would your lifestyle be the same as it was back in the 50s, or do you think it would be different? Have things changed that much that you could, no longer function the same way?
Well, first of all, I don't think I'd get in. The requirements are really hard. Second thing, I was able to wash dishes and work at a music store and completely paid for everything. My semester cost me only $37.50. So for $75 a year, whatever I paid at the fraternity to live there, once I washed dishes and worked in the record store, I had enough money so that I could be an undergraduate and focus. If I did get in, and I did have the wherewithal to finance being here, I think my life would not be the same. I think I would probably be like these other students, running around and working a lot harder.
Marvin, did you ever think of leaving Berkeley as a faculty member? Were you recruited by other places?
I was recruited by a lot of other places. But what happened was, when I got tenure, I took all those moving boxes that Bell Labs had given me to come to Berkeley. I took them to the Berkeley dump and I burned them. And I said I would never leave. And over the years, whenever I got an offer, I would say, no, I'm going to die in Berkeley. And I've been very, very comfortable having made that decision quite early, and I've never regretted it.
Well, it's been fantastic for collaborators to have you at Berkeley. I think you and I have published over the years over 90 research papers together.
Uh-huh.
And in the last couple of years, something like 15 papers. Well, Marvin, thank you for the absolutely fascinating interview, and best wishes for a continued long career in condensed metaphysics.
Okay. Thank you for the interview. Thank you for the questions. As you can see, I'm really a lucky person who knew what they wanted to do and had an opportunity to be where they wanted to be and got to interact with people like you, which really made my life here at Berkeley a wonderful period.
And I'm glad we're able to memorialize some of your experiences for the Legacy Project. So thank you again.
Thank you.